They thought forcing me out would save them a pension. After 29 years of building their core infrastructure, they fired me the day before retirement. No handshake, no thank you, just a paper and a smile. But what they didn't know was that I'd built the foundation they stood on. And when they cut me out, the system they ignored finally stopped listening to them. This isn't just about revenge, it's about respect. Stay with me, subscribe if you've ever been underestimated, and tell me in the comments what would you have done. I stood outside the glass door of the executive floor, holding the envelope I'd been told to bring. My badge still worked that morning, which almost felt like a mistake. After 25 years at NorthBridge Capital Systems, I'd expected a quiet exit, maybe a handshake, maybe a few kind words from people who used to rely on me to keep the company's digital heart beating. Instead, I found Ethan Cole waiting with a smile too smooth to be real. He didn't offer me a seat, just slid a folder across the table. Patricia, the company's restructuring. Effective immediately. That was it. No ceremony, no preamble. My name on a single page, my pension frozen, my signature expected at the bottom. I read it once, my throat tightened, but my voice didn't waver when I asked, "That's final?" He nodded, pretending to care. I'd seen that look before young executives who believed speed was intelligence and disruption was wisdom. He didn't know that every server, every compliance layer, every encrypted rail running through this institution had passed through my hands. I built the structure that carried their billions. I made sure it could never be corrupted. But I also made sure it could recognize corruption when it happened. Ethan never understood that part. He only cared about cutting costs and polishing the image for investors. As I stood there, I realized how completely he misunderstood what I'd done for this place. I wasn't just writing code. I was creating a spine of integrity through a system that could tell the difference between leadership and greed. He didn't even thank me. He just gestured to HR like it was an errand he wanted finished before lunch. The folder was heavier than paper had any right to be. Inside, it was 25 years of work reduced to an exit signature. I signed it, quietly, because silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. I wanted to look him in the eye, to make him see that what he'd just done would echo far longer than he could imagine. But he wouldn't meet my gaze. He was already on his phone, scheduling the announcement. That's when it hit me, not anger, but clarity. He thought firing me was control. It wasn't. It was removal of the one thing that kept his empire steady. I gathered my things, one photo of my daughter, a worn leather notebook, and a pen I'd used since the day NorthBridge launched its first payment network. The walk down the hallway was slow, not because I was sad, but because I was remembering. The late nights debugging while management slept, the weekends I gave up to secure their compliance audits, the times I refused to sign falsified reports. They called it stubbornness. I called it integrity. When I reached the exit, I paused for a second, holding my badge to the scanner. The light blinked green for the last time. A sound that used to comfort me now felt like closure. As the door clicked open, I didn't look back. There was no point. Everything that mattered was already written into the backbone of the system, where truth always lived longer than ego. Outside, the city buzzed with the same noise it always had. Impatient, loud, transactional. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. Then I took out my phone, deleted every NorthBridge contact, and sent a single message to myself. You built it right. Now go build something better. I didn't go back, I went in a different direction. Long before the layoff, before the polite dismissal wrapped in corporate language, I'd already started noticing the cracks. Ethan had come from a tech startup world where everything was move fast and optimize later. He thought legacy systems were dead weight. To him, people like me were relics, steady hands that slowed down his sprint toward the next investor meeting. But he never understood that what he called legacy was the reason NorthBridge had never failed an audit, never suffered a data breach, never lost the trust of regulators. I had spent decades weaving that stability into the foundation, piece by piece, until it became invisible because solid systems don't make noise. I remember the day that silence started to break. Ethan had called me into a product meeting filled with new hires half my age, eager and polished, reciting buzzwords like poetry. They called the old framework antiquated, said the future was in speed-driven blockchain integrations. I asked one question: how would they ensure transactional traceability under those conditions? The room went silent. Then Ethan smiled in that dismissive way only a man certain of his invincibility could. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said. But I knew bridges like that collapse long before you reach the other side. That's when I started keeping notes quietly, privately. Not about revenge, about design. I'd written hundreds of pages in my leather notebook, everything I'd learned about ethics and code, how transparency builds trust, how shortcuts always rot systems from within. When I went home at night, I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning continuity. I wanted to make sure that what I'd built wouldn't die with their arrogance. Around that time, I met Rhea. She was the CTO of a small fintech startup called SilverOak. We'd crossed paths at an infrastructure security summit. She wasn't interested in corporate optics, she wanted reliability. When she found out I was from NorthBridge, her tone softened, almost apologetic. "You're the one who wrote the integrity rails, right?" I didn't confirm, but her respect said enough. Weeks later, after Ethan sidelined me from yet another project and cut my team's resources, I received an email from SilverOak. "We'd love to talk." No formalities, just ideas. I didn't respond immediately. Loyalty meant something to me, even if it didn't to them. But one evening, after HR quietly removed my name from an internal proposal I had authored, the decision made itself. I drove home under the same city lights I used to find comforting, but that night they felt cold, transactional, fluorescent instead of warm. When I reached my apartment, I opened the SilverOak email again. It wasn't a job offer. It was a conversation about purpose, how to build systems that protect users instead of exploiting them. It was everything NorthBridge had forgotten to value. Within weeks, I met with Rhea and her small team in a shared workspace overlooking the bay. Their servers were old, their budget limited, but their ethics were clean. For the first time in years, I didn't have to translate integrity into corporate language. They didn't want to move fast and break things, they wanted to move right and make them last. That was enough for me. When I left that night, Rhea said quietly, "If they don't see you, we will." I smiled, not as someone plotting revenge, but as someone who had finally found the right battlefield. SilverOak's office didn't look like much the first time I walked in. No marble floors, no automated espresso machines, no glass walls for investors to admire themselves through. Just a handful of engineers hunched over their monitors, surrounded by wires and whiteboards filled with equations that actually meant something. It smelled like burnt coffee and potential. Rhea introduced me to Marcus, the data systems lead, and within 10 minutes we were arguing in the best way possible about protocol hierarchies and redundancy models. I hadn't felt that kind of alive in years. There was no hierarchy here, no fear of asking hard questions, no need to justify caution as intelligence. They didn't see me as legacy. They saw me as leverage. My first few weeks were quiet. I didn't talk much about NorthBridge. I told them I'd spent years building financial infrastructure, nothing more. But inside, I knew exactly what we needed to do. NorthBridge's biggest weakness wasn't its speed, it was its vanity. They built systems to impress shareholders, not to protect clients. Their compliance layers were shallow, and their encryption protocols had been patched so many times they barely held together. I began sketching the outline for what would become the Aurora framework, a distributed ledger system that could self-audit in real time, spotting anomalies before they became vulnerabilities. It wasn't glamorous. It was clean, efficient, incorruptible, the kind of architecture that didn't need a press release to prove its worth. Every night after the team left, I stayed behind, mapping out data bridges, encryption tiers, and resilience threads that could sustain entire national networks. It was methodical, almost meditative. I wasn't chasing retribution. I was rebuilding belief in work done right, in code that honored the people using it. SilverOak's engineers learned fast. Within months, we had prototypes running cleaner than anything NorthBridge had ever fielded. When Ria presented the beta model to potential investors, she didn't oversell it. She simply said, "It works because we listened to the people who built the last system." That was enough. Funding arrived faster than I expected. What started as a small fintech startup began to scale rapidly, and soon, SilverOak was competing for mid-tier clients NorthBridge used to take for granted. I remember watching their announcements, Ethan on stage, talking about reinvention and digital agility, but I could see it in the way he spoke, the way he avoided specifics. He didn't understand the architecture holding his empire together. He'd inherited trust he didn't deserve. Meanwhile, our trust was earned line by line. Aurora wasn't just a platform, it was a statement. Every safeguard was documented, every function traceable. We ran stress tests under simulated cyber attacks, under transactional spikes, under user errors. It never broke. NorthBridge's clients began noticing. They reached out quietly to SilverOak, asking about our uptime, about our data transparency. We didn't pitch against NorthBridge, we simply performed better. Within a year, we were on the radar for a major federal contract to modernize government digital payments, a deal worth $500 million. It was the kind of opportunity Ethan had built his career chasing. And the irony? He didn't even know who he was competing against yet. By then, SilverOak's systems had matured enough to make us a legitimate contender. I made sure Aurora could integrate seamlessly with legacy networks like the one I had built at NorthBridge. Not to sabotage it, but because I knew their inefficiencies better than anyone else. That knowledge became our edge. When Ria asked why I spent so much time optimizing compatibility with NorthBridge protocols, I said, because they're going to underestimate us. And when they do, I want their comparison to be immediate and painful. She didn't ask further questions. She trusted my calm. It wasn't rage that drove me, it was precision. I wasn't trying to destroy Ethan, I was proving a point the only way people like him understood, through measurable outcomes. While he chased headlines, I built foundations. While he marketed agility, I engineered endurance. By the time Aurora went live, it wasn't just a system, it was a mirror held up to everything NorthBridge had become. And deep down, I knew the day would come when they'd have to face that reflection. The day of the government contract presentation felt almost unreal. Months of preparation condensed into a single afternoon. The stakes were astronomical, one contract that would define the next decade of digital finance infrastructure across the country. SilverOak and NorthBridge were the final contenders. Ethan had lobbied hard to make sure his company was invited, confident that brand reputation alone would carry them through. What he didn't realize was that reputation doesn't replace reliability, and reliability was the one thing Aurora had mastered. Ria asked me to attend the pitch, not as a presenter, but as the silent architect. I preferred it that way. The fewer who knew my history with NorthBridge, the cleaner the reveal would be when the results spoke for themselves. The conference center was a sea of polished ambition executives in dark suits, glossy brochures, and scripted smiles. Ethan entered surrounded by his entourage, exuding the kind of confidence that only comes from ignorance. When his eyes swept across the room, I could tell he didn't recognize me. He had never looked at anyone twice, unless they were above him in the org chart. We sat across from each other, separated by a single table and a decade of lessons. NorthBridge went first. Their presentation was sleek, visual, and hollow. Ethan talked about scalability, AI integration, and digital modernization, all buzzwords, no backbone. He spoke the language of persuasion, not precision. Their slides showed projections, but the call came 3 days after the contract was announced. I knew it would. The moment SilverOak's victory made headlines, NorthBridge's phone lines must have been burning. Ethan's voice was exactly as I remembered it, smooth, confident, pretending calm. "Patricia," he said, "we'd like to congratulate you on whatever role you played at SilverOak." The pause after that word, whatever, was almost amusing. He wanted to sound magnanimous, but every syllable trembled with the panic of someone who just realized they weren't untouchable anymore. He started offering things: a consulting position, a signing bonus, full control over the next upgrade cycle. It was almost poetic. Months ago, he'd called me redundant. Now I was essential. I let him talk until the silence between his words grew longer than his pitch. Then I said what I'd been saving for the right moment. Ethan, I don't build systems for people who lie to them. And before he could reply, I ended the call. That should have been enough closure, but they kept trying. HR sent emails about a strategic reconciliation. A board member reached out off the record. They even offered to make a public statement about recognizing foundational contributors. Translation: they wanted my name attached to stability again. But you can't borrow integrity once it's gone. Each message felt like a reminder of how desperate they'd become to fix a structure that never valued the architect. Ria asked me one afternoon if I'd ever consider returning, just for the optics of it. I laughed quietly. Optics are what got them here. She nodded, understanding. SilverOak didn't need grand gestures. Our system spoke for itself: fast, secure, transparent, and most importantly, trusted. That trust spread faster than any marketing campaign could. Clients defected from NorthBridge in waves, quietly at first, then publicly, when journalists started asking why the smaller firm was outperforming the established giant. It wasn't sabotage, it was gravity. People naturally move toward what holds them safely. NorthBridge didn't just lose a deal, they lost credibility, and the more they reached out to me, the clearer it became. They weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to rewrite history. That was never my game. One evening, as I watched the city lights flicker against the bay, I opened my laptop and logged into LinkedIn. The notification bar was overflowing: congratulations, connection requests, interview offers, news tags. I hovered over the edit profile button, deleted the entire work history section tied to NorthBridge, and switched my profile visibility to private. Not out of bitterness, but closure. My story didn't belong to their narrative anymore. When I closed the laptop, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. Revenge didn't require noise. It required evolution. They could keep chasing the illusion of speed. I had already built something that would outlast their shortcuts. So when the next call came, I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence was already louder than their apology. When the headlines finally turned on NorthBridge, I wasn't surprised. Systems collapse the same way people do, quietly at first, then all at once. Their infrastructure started failing under its own weight, patch over patch of rushed code, shortcuts masquerading as innovation. Investors withdrew, compliance reviews reopened, and whispers of an ethics inquiry spread across the industry. I didn't need to read the articles to know what they said. I'd seen that kind of unraveling before. The difference this time was that I wasn't inside it. I was watching from across the bay, coffee in hand, unshaken. People called it revenge. I didn't. It wasn't fire or fury that leveled them, it was math. Equations built on false assumptions eventually balanced themselves. What failed at NorthBridge wasn't the technology, it was the trust. They had taken something built on integrity and tried to repurpose it for ego. Aurora, on the other hand, thrived because we treated transparency as strength, not an obstacle. Clients didn't come to SilverOak because of me. They came because they could finally see what honesty and infrastructure look like, Ria said, once that ethics don't scale easily. Maybe that's true, but they endure. And endurance wins wars quietly. I didn't celebrate their decline, though people expected me to. I didn't post statements, didn't leak details, didn't appear on panels. I just kept working. There was something deeply satisfying about progress unannounced. My days were full again, reviewing proposals, mentoring engineers, designing expansions for Aurora's second phase. I watched SilverOak's reputation rise slowly, not from hype, but from reliability. That was the kind of growth no marketing team could fabricate. Every so often, I'd get a message from an old colleague at NorthBridge. Some apologized, some wanted advice, Some just needed to say they understood now. I replied to a few, ignored the rest. Closure wasn't about forgiveness, it was about perspective. I had built something they could have built too, if they'd valued the right things. Instead, they chose speed over stewardship, profit over principle. They called it leadership. I called it decay. The irony is that in the end, the system remembered who it trusted. Aurora wasn't born out of revenge, it was born out of refusal. Refusal to shrink, to compromise, to let corruption rewrite clean code. I didn't destroy NorthBridge. They did that the moment they forgot who kept the lights on. I just outgrew them, one quiet decision at a time. Months after the collapse, SilverOak launched Aurora's second generation. We didn't hold a press conference. We didn't need to. The system spoke for itself, steady, unbroken, transparent. The industry started calling it the Patricia standard, though I never asked for that. I'd built it to prove a principle, not to brand one. The morning it went live, I arrived early, before the office lights fully warmed, and found a small black box on my desk. Inside was a brass plaque engraved with a simple line: systems that protect their makers. No signature, no note, just the message. I ran my fingers over the lettering, feeling a quiet pride that didn't need witnesses. Across the skyline, I could see the old NorthBridge Tower still standing, but smaller somehow. They were still operating, still patching what they broke, but their name no longer inspired trust. That kind of loss can't be measured in dollars. I didn't hate them for it. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend building. What mattered to me was what came after the new engineers, who cared more about clarity than speed, the young developers who asked about ethics before optimization. Maybe that's what legacy really means, not what you build for yourself, but what you leave for people who still believe integrity belongs in architecture. Before leaving that evening, I mounted the plaque beside my office door. I didn't post it online, didn't announce it. Some things don't need an audience to matter. As I turned off the lights, I looked once more at the quiet hum of servers in the next room. Steady, dependable, uncorrupted. That sound, not applause, was the real ending. I didn't design Aurora to punish anyone. I designed it to remember the kind of people worth building for. Looking back, what happened wasn't about a company or a contract. It was about what happens when people mistake silence for weakness. I learned that in a world obsessed with speed and visibility, quiet integrity can feel invisible until the moment it's gone. You can spend years building something honest, and all it takes is one careless decision for someone to think they can replace the builder and keep the structure standing. They can't, because systems, whether digital or human, always remember what they were built on. When NorthBridge fired me, they didn't just lose an employee. They lost the trust encoded in every decision, every ethical line I refused to cross. My revenge wasn't destruction, it was distance. I didn't burn their world down, I simply built a better one and let the truth do what truth always does: expose shortcuts. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. My silence forced them to hear what words never could. It reminded me that walking away isn't surrender if you're walking toward something stronger. Revenge at its best isn't loud or cruel. It's alignment, choosing not to fight where integrity can't survive. And maybe that's something every working person in America understands right now: being undervalued, overlooked, replaced by someone cheaper or louder. But here's what no company teaches you: your quiet consistency, your ethics, your boundaries are leverage. They may not notice it today, but they'll feel the absence when you're gone. Integrity isn't a brand. It's the architecture holding your future steady. How to get started today. Don't react immediately to injustice. Record, observe, understand where your real power lies. Start documenting your work, your value, your principles, because evidence speaks louder than outrage. Build something of your own, even small: a skill, a portfolio, a side idea that proves your worth isn't owned by anyone else. Learn to walk away before they force you to. Freedom feels different when it's chosen. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the person they underestimated, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe. Because sometimes the best revenge stories aren't about payback, they're about rebuilding better.